Tristan, she softly cried. In the effort not to faint, Isabel now did drop to her knees. The white man said, "You foul black whore, you were about to blow the bastard," and slapped her hard so that she fell to the sand beside the banderance's body. Inches from her eyes, José's scarlet brains, lumpy like rice pudding soaked in beet juice, were leaking from the terrible rent in his skull. Racked by extremes of emotion, disgust, terror, amazement, relief, Isabel began to weep. "How did you know my name?" She left off weeping and stared up at this man accusingly. "Tristan, how can you not know me? I let myself be made black so you could be white. A shaman did it, far to the west, where one can see mountains whose tips are all ice." He squatted down to her. "Isabel? Is it you?" He explored with trembling fingertips her face, her everted, full lips. "It is you. Your eyes." She felt in the darkness within her skull, that theater of spirit, a mere bloody rice pudding, the warm tears wanting to begin again. "Are my eyes all you have left to love? My old, cold eyes? Then so be it, Tristan. Do not love me. Merely use me. I will be your slave. Already you have begun to beat me. Already you are too proud, too fastidious, to give my mouth a kiss. When I was your color, and you were mine, I took you, a mere street boy, a miserable moleka, to my uncle's apartment, where there were more expensive things than you had ever seen. Your eyes were like saucers, and gave you my virgin's blood, though it hurt me horribly. I never told you how much it hurt that day. You were too big and rough." "I did not mean to be rough. It was the clumsiness of innocence." This was so honest, she was compelled to answer in kind. "Perhaps you were only as rough as you had to be." "We gave each other ourselves," he said. "We gave what we had to give. Where is the ring that says Dar?" "It was the price the shaman wanted, so you could be white and no longer a slave." Selflessly as she had acted, she yet felt afraid, telling him this. He restated, as if incredulous, "You gave away the ring with which we pledged ourselves." "I did not give it away. I exchanged it for your life. Your blackness had enslaved you here, and before then had roused my guardian's enmity." He became thoughtful, touching his blond beard. "Indeed so, my dearest. You did beautifully." He extended his hand, helping her up from the sandy earth, where José's head like a split gourd leaked its juicy contents. They moved away and sat together on what had been the porch of Antonio's house. "Let me tell you my story. It was very strange," he began. "Day by day, for 7 days, the black went out of me. I did not know why. First I became gray, then white, as if I had never seen the sun. Your ancient fool of a so-called husband, Antonio Peixoto, at first laid it to one of these diseases that are always carrying off the slaves they capture. But then, when my health did not otherwise alter, and the other white killers superstitiously removed my shackles, he vaulted over them in superstition and said my becoming a Christian like them was a sign from God to pull up camp and move on. José objected that the manioc and sweet potatoes were not yet harvested, and the canoes were not all fashioned, but Antonio called him a heretic. The others sided with their leader and clamored to move on, and since there were canoes enough for only a few of their Indian escort, they killed the women and children and burned the huts. Antonio directed the other men to bind up José and abandoned him in a place where there were many anthills. He came back, as you saw, as a madman. I have been watching him these last days, forage and rage, wondering, since I am now his color, if we might strike up a partnership to escape the Mato Grosso, until today forced my hand. Something told me to save you, though from a distance you were only a struggling shadow. "And my son, Salomão?" Isabel asked, unable to overcome a certain shyness with this white and newly voluble Tristão, though at the same time her own new self gave her, in an inner place she had not begun to explore, a fresh edge. Antonio took him with him, he said. In his fanaticism he believes the poor babe to be a kind of saint who will lead him to paradise for all of his sins. But I fear for the fate of the entire expedition, Isabel. They will never reach the Madeira. Not in those canoes, at least, she said. For her tiny, whey-faced son, she tried to summon a maternal morning, a milky flow of feeling, but instead produced a stringent wry relief that he was off her hands, through no fault of her own. She was free to concentrate on the loved one before her. Tristão decided they were not to leave the encampment immediately, but to bury the corpses, re-roof the upright log walls of Antonio's old shelter, and wait for the manioc and beans and sweet potatoes to mature. Then, laden with farinha Isabel had pounded into powder and the son had dehydrated, and with dried meat prepared from the fruits of his hunting with an old blunderbuss the Bandeirantes had left behind, they would set out across the Chapeau d'Ouance, where they once, alone together, had nearly starved. When the burned roof was replaced with interwoven palms, Tristão and Isabel had privacy enough to re-explore their marriage. 3 years had passed since the flare-up of their sexuality, a flare-up fanned by the fevers of starvation and the romantic imminence of death. Since then, Isabel and Tristão had done nothing to earn their name as lovers. Now, slowly, they reclaimed for cultivation the muddy riverside tract of sex. Their new skins gave them a fresh opportunity for that most parlous act of love, negotiation. Who were they, these psychic shapes, each to be defined by the invasion of the other? With different skins came different glands, different smells, different hair, different self-images, different histories. There was something sardonic in her sexuality now, something jaded by the experience of black female generations. From her dead white mother, Isabel had inherited mostly an empty flirtatiousness and perhaps a fear of childbirth. Now a different inheritance had descended, and a strength not merely passive. Black, she found in herself a store of reckless anger, and became, when darkness enclosed the rustling straw pallet she and Tristão shared, something of a bully, a rough tease. The sexual world, being the underside of the real world, is to an extent an inversion of it. An underdog, he had been top before. Now it was she who dominated and demanded. To use the terminology in which she and Eudoxia in their girlhoods had gossiped about the nuns, she was the cock, and he the hen. Tristão loved her more than ever. He was dizzy with his new love of her, which was confused with love of his white self. Their new relation gave at last full scope to his instinctive chivalry. He, too, had felt the something brutish in his former appeal to her. He had not been insensitive to the burden her loss of social position placed on his shoulders, the flattering wreath of martyrdom it enabled her to wear, or to the indignities of her whoredom at the mine and her concubinage at the camp. Had he not been black, would she have been so casually and serenely unfaithful? True, she could justly blame his poverty and helplessness as leaving her no choice. But had she not taken a certain relish in her degradation because the blame was his? She had used him to become shameless, denying him the luxury of shame. She had led him through the expensive streets of Ipanema and through a subsequent maze he could never have entered without her. She had condescended to their perils, and it was her love, therefore, which had shone the brighter, with greater heat of self-sacrifice. Now it was he who descended, to accept a nigger wench as his mate. It was he who now tasted the thrill of sexual release, when the loved one is not a social and spiritual equal, but a thing of flesh, imported from afar. A thing with a psychology, It is the psychology that leads our love on, twisting it, deepening it, but the thingness, like a more massive and versatile masturbator's hand, that delivers the bliss. Her whole body was the thing, in the bulges and recesses that seemed more emphatic now that she was no longer the color of clouds and crystalline smoke, but that of earth, of wet, smooth wood, of glistening dung. There was hostility in her, but he did not mind as long as he could pin her down and fuck her with a freed hostility. At the end of one such session, she amazed him by nestling her bottom against his stomach and preparing to sleep and saying, "Maybe that is the one that will make a baby." Thus she admitted what her daylight self had never confessed, that they had not yet made a baby together. "I hope not," he confessed in turn. "Not yet. We must escape the wilderness first. Once we are back in civilization, you will drop me. You will use me as your whore for a time, but find another wife, a white wife." "Never. You are my only wife. I will never leave you. I love you as you are. You have all your old elegance, and something else as well. Forgive me, but I think you have become your true self. You were black all along. Your whiteness was a disguise." At last the time came to dig up the manioc roots, crush them into powder, bake them into salty cakes, and depart. Fearing the Guaycuru, they tried to stay north of their former route, steering now by the rising sun. Perhaps it was their new route, but the vast barren upland seemed to be tamer than before, when Kupahaki had led them through it. In the second week of walking, Isabel gave up her wistful, unrealistic hope of encountering Indian horsemen, and with them Azor and Cordelia, in beads and painted undress, but alive. In the third week, she and Tristan began to come upon farms. As they made their way east, the farms increased in number and prosperity and gave rise to dusty small towns where the couple was able to recoup their resources by finding work. In one town, Tristan won employment with the blacksmith, and in yet another as an auto mechanic, automobiles slowly replacing horse-drawn conveyances on the dusty roads of the backlands. Wherever they worked, the couple in their liveliness and grace attracted kindness, and were more than once offered opportunities to settle permanently. When they came to actual cities, they began to have city adventures. Isabel found a store selling jewelry and silver whose proprietor was able to appreciate the fine quality of Uncle Donaciano's begemmed antique Holy Cross. Other dealers had been bored by the antique holy object, but this one's eyes lit up. He was a Cafuzo, a mixture of black and Indian, with slanted eyes and a receding hairline. He struck up a collusion with her against the invisible owners of the establishment, who he claimed were Japanese agri-industrialists in far-off Rio Grande do Sul, and gave her a price, 10,000 cruzeros, that was absurdly generous, he swore, for such a common and useless item. "But I confess it. I am not merely a dispassionate student of religions. I am an ardent devotee of several. You have found out my weakness, little lady." He furthermore suggested that during the day's long lunch break, between 1 and 4:30, she might join him in his room upstairs. "How much am I worth to you?" she asked, with an easy bluntness she wouldn't have managed in her old skin. "I will give you a delicious lunch," the jeweler promised, "and play you my records of the newest Afoché songs from Bahia." "I am hard," she told him brazenly, "esto dura," meaning both she was hard up for money and sexually excited by him. She said, 100 cruzeros. I think I must be worth as much as 1/100th of that trinket. Its arms do not move. It hears prayers but does not answer them. I will answer your prayers, if they are not too indecent. He professed astonishment and indignation and eventually reduced her to 65, which he would add to the price of the purchased object, thus transferring the cost of his tryst to the distant Japanese owners. His room upstairs was crowded and bright, like the jungle Isabel had traversed with the Anapamoko. It was clamorously full of parrot-colored religious statues. Their sex, when they finally came to it, seemed perfunctory and tame compared with what she and Tristan had developed. This was not a man who loved a woman to the point of self-annihilation. She had been spoiled for any other kind. Nevertheless, she went back to the jeweler several times and deposited the money she wheedled from him in a bank account, indexed to grow with inflation. Eventually, she and Tristan accumulated enough money and clothes and city wisdom to depart, not by bus but by DC-7, a hop of less than an hour, to Brasilia. Their journey from the encampment had taken the better part of a year. 8 years had passed since Isabel had been a student here at the university, and she and Tristan had lain together amid the wild banana trees and Spanish bayonet in one of the capital's vast median strips. Her father was no longer ambassador to Afghanistan. Now he served the big boys as Assistant Minister of Interior Development, with a suite of offices in the marble stretches of the Palacio do Planalto. He sounded, when he picked up the phone, older to Isabel. His old paternal force and majesty dwindled. Or was it that she had been seasoned in hardship and love and had grown to adulthood? She was now 29 and had noticed a few white circlets in her halo of tightly kinked hair. In certain lights, the backs of her hands looked ropey and the skin beneath her chin a trifle loose. Her father did not argue or resist when she firmly told him, "Daddy, I am well, no thanks to you. I want to visit you, and for you at last to meet my compañero, my dear husband." His silence was not long, and may have been merely a diplomat's attempt to find appropriate phrasing. "My darling, nothing could please me more." His apartment, in the white-sided, curved, glass-balconied skyscraper on the Eixo Rodoviario Norte, seemed less grand than it had when she had lived here as an impressionable college girl. Salomão Leme had aged, though his tiny narrow feet still twinkled in his patent leather at-home slippers. Did she imagine it, or did a tiny muscle below one of those gray eyes twitch with shock at the sight of her? "My beautiful child," he said, and softly gripped her shoulders the better to stare at her defiant monkey face. "Father, this is my husband, or fiancé, or something, Tristan Raposo." Just the sight of her father had made her feel giddy and girlish, certain of indulgence. "Enchanted," her father said, taking the younger man's lean, pale white hand in his own pudgier hand. "As am I, sir," said Tristan. The manservant had glided in with almost a dance step. Isabel asked him for a glass of wine, and her father, expansively, gesturing with his short arms for a gimlet, very dry, with 2 onions, and Tristan, puritanically, for a vitamina. "From your accent, you are a carioca," her father told Tristan. "Born and bred, sir. My family lived on the slopes of the Morro de Babilonia. The house was not much, but we enjoyed a splendid view of the sea." The diplomat said, "I no longer know Rio well, though my brother cannot be pried from the place, like a hermit crab in a discarded shell. My life in Rio ended, practically speaking, when the capital was moved to Brasilia." "A brave move that did our nation proud," said Tristan. "And yet I wonder," said Salomão, seating himself in the green chair that was, Isabel knew, only his second favorite. And he told a long story about himself as a young man, when his wife, God rest her breathtakingly beautiful soul, was still alive, and Isabel was an infant, and how they came to Brasilia when it was just a wilderness, an ancient dream sustained by a few dedicated men. Isabel let her attention wander, since she had heard the story before, or stories like it. She stood up and moved to the windows and looked out upon the cubes of Brasilia glowing in the velvet night that had descended. These two men at her back loved her, and when she heard her father's story finally reach its point, and Tristan bring forth an appreciative laugh, she turned triumphantly, her abdomen buzzing with its butterflies, to face their double blast of adoration. But they were ignoring her, excluding her. Tristan was telling, in courteous turn, a story of his own. Their laughter and talk, male laughter and male talk, tumbled on as their wills playfully wrestled. The servant brought her a second glass of wine, her father a second gimlet, Tristan a second vitamina. The wine began to press on her bladder. The city lights and the nostalgia of being back in this apartment and the strangeness of hearing her father and lover laugh together pressed on her eyes, forming tears. The two men were aware of her, as the magnet that had brought them together. As soon as she was out of earshot in the bathroom, Tristan asked Salomon, in a low, deliberate voice, "Do you see, how can I say, any physical difference in her?" Salomon blinked but said nothing. Tristan pursued awkwardly, "Is her complexion, to be specific, as you remember it? Though I scolded her, she did not always in our travel wear a hat in the sun." The diplomat spoke as carefully as if the words were memorized, or in a foreign language he had but lately learned. "To a father, a daughter is always perfection. I find Isabel as enchanting as I did when I first saw her in her mother's arms. Do not worry overmuch about protecting her from the sun. She takes a tan well." He held the other man's eyes with his own. "Do you not join me in finding my daughter perfection?" Tristan said firmly, "Sir, I do. I also loved Isabel at first sight, and each day since that glimpse she has given fresh cause for my love to increase. She is not merely beautiful, but brave, and not only brave, but resourceful. I have found my fate and the purpose of my life in loving her. She is perfection." Salomon heard a grim undertone as the young husband pronounced these insistences, but ascribed it to the well-known melancholy of the Portuguese race. Yes, they lived happily then in São Paulo, first in an apartment in Higienópolis, and then in a house in the Jardim America district off the Rua Groenlândia, for a dozen years in all. The Lemay brothers succeeded in obtaining for Tristan a position in middle management, not at the Fuschka plant where he had tightened engine-mounting bolts opposite gap-toothed Oscar, for Fuschkas were no longer made, but at a textile mill in São Bernardo, one of the so-called ABCD cities, industrial satellites of São Paulo. Yet Tristan never really felt at home in São Paulo, except in his daily commute to the industrial belt and the routes to certain favored restaurants and their beach house in Ubatuba. He was forever getting lost, finding himself going around on the same viaduct, or circling the same neighborhood, or one that looked exactly like it. He could not shake the impression, received on his first visit nearly 20 years before, that the city had no limits, no shape, compared with Rio. Isabel, patterning herself after spotty girlish memories of her mother and her dashing Aunt Luna, went through the motions of being a young housewife of the middle class. To be of the middle class in Brazil is to enjoy what, in countries where wealth is more equitably distributed, would be an aristocratic lifestyle. Servants are cheaper than appliances, and Isabel had from the start a combination maid and cook, and then employed when they moved from the Higienópolis apartment to the house off the Rua Groenlândia, a woman to take care of the children. There were 3, Bartolomeo, the offspring of the religious Cafuzo, with Ethiopian eyes and skin but one shade lighter than her own, and 3 years later the twins, Aloisio and Aphrodisia, none identical, but born of the same gush of sperm late at night between bouts of the lambada at the Centre de Cristal in a broom closet on the way to the ladies' room, out of a man she hardly knew, a business contact of Tristan's. After this indiscretion reaped its alarming double harvest, neither non-identical twin showing a glimmer of Tristan's natural dignity or a wisp of his straight, fair hair, Isabel began to practice birth control by sleeping with no one but her husband. She had long since realized that the price for the intensity of their love was sterility. Their spiritual ardor burned away the natural consequences of physical union. Whether he with other women might have become a father, or indeed was, and that somewhere in some jungle or other a little brown Tristan was padding with bright frog eyes through the sensitive early years of his life, interested her rather abstractly, as belonging to some other story. In the story which was hers, in the life given to her to live, and which was now rushing on, it seemed to her, at an annihilating pace. She found herself touched by a certain pity for Tristan, a sense of him as her victim, as if it had been she, not he, who had made the approach on Copacabana beach. "You are in no danger from me," he had assured her on the beach, though he radiated menace and a desperate freedom. But had he been in danger from her? In these years there were, for Tristan and Isabel, promotions at work, renovations at home, little crises in health, an automobile accident or two, vacations, and the steady rise of Bartolomeo, Aloisio, and Aphrodisia in the fashionable Catholic schools they attended. And there was a funeral. Isabel's father died of myocarditis, induced by overwork and the cumulative strain of all the diseases and derangements of the body incidental to his years abroad. Among his effects, surprisingly, they found the gold nugget that Tristan had gouged from the Serra do Barraco, and that had been last seen in the care of the cooperative bank. It had found its way into the care of the Assistant Minister of Interior Development. Salomon's death made them less additionally rich than they had expected. An odd thing had happened to Uncle Donaciano. Divorce had become legal in 1977, and a decade later he had, after all those years of unacknowledged cohabitation, divorced Aunt Luna and married his housekeeper and cook, Maria. Within a year she had left him. No one could imagine why. He seemed fated to romantic failure, and Isabel felt sorry for him, and her visits to her bachelor uncle became more frequent. Isabel persuaded Tristan to come with her in the several days of vacation that the textile plant allowed after Christmas. They thought of bringing along the children, but agreed that Rio under its holiday sun offered pre-teens too much opportunity for mischief, and that their lanky, rebellious presence in the apartment would be difficult for their childless, aging host. Uncle Donaciano welcomed them warmly, gratefully. He had aged, at the blow to his pride from his second wife. They sat up late, Isabel and her uncle reminiscing about her mother, about the days when Rio was like a glass of Venetian crystal, about the trips to Petropolis to escape the summer heat. Tristan, listening, grew restless. He had little to contribute. Their world had not been his world. In Sao Paulo, he had created a past, and among their friends could reminisce to the depth of 12 years. Here Tristan had little to do but puff on a Cuban cigar. In his enforced idleness, he studied Isabel, dewy-faced, lost in her dream of childhood, imagining an idol for herself. This had been her world, an enchanted world. What had she wanted of me, he smokily wondered. Nothing but his yam, the yam of a stranger, to do nature's dirty work. At last their host, his striped hair standing up in loose feathers, dottered toward bed, and the couple made their way to their own bedroom. Tristan said, "My love, would you mind if I took a walk? I am not used to cigars, or to so much dinner conversation." "We bored you, I know, darling. Forgive us. He is the only person I know now," Isabel told him, "who remembers me as I was when I was innocent. He knows, Tristan told her. He knows that I in my gray suit am the same black trash he forbade his niece to go with 22 years ago. He knows and can't do anything about it. He doesn't want to do anything about it, Isabel told Tristan, caressing his face, trying to rub the crease of anger from his tall forehead with her thumb. He sees I am happy, and that is all he wants. I enjoyed watching you and your uncle, he told her, in a voice fallen wearily into its manly timbre. There is true affection between you, based on blood and shared memories. I am melancholy, being so close to my old home. Tristan, they are gone. Your mother, the whole lot. The favela was raised to make a botanical garden and a tourist outlook. Yes, he sighed. Time conquers rich and poor alike. But you must let me have a little walk around the block. My calves are cramping. My head is stuffy. I will be back in a matter of minutes. Compose yourself for sleep, my dearest. I will take a key, and if you are not still awake, I will slip into your dreams. I will be naked. She pushed her warm lips up into his. Go out, but be careful, she said seriously. He was surprised. Careful in his own city? How old had he become? She was 40, he 41. Looking back at her, as she slipped off her brassiere and jokingly posed for him beside their wide white bed in the jaunty posture of a naked boche dancer, he remembered her asking, "You still like me?" The sight of her sucked at him powerfully, but he went out the door. The air in the tropics suggests during the day that nothing can be accomplished, that decay and lassitude are man's lot. But at night, the air feels full of excitement and potential action. Some humid, perfumed promise waits in it to be realized. He walked toward the distant music from the boaches along Copacabana Beach. The shops of Ipanema were shuttered. The doormen of the apartment buildings stood behind their transparent doors like visitors to an aquarium, through whose murky waters Tristan swam. He crossed the avenida and stepped from the sidewalk into the sand. He sat on a bench, removed his black-laced shoes and silk-ribbed socks, and hid them in a patch of beach pea near the bench. Small clumps of grass, beach pea, and sea grape grew near the sidewalk for all the feet that had passed this way each day. To his bare soles, the sand felt tepid on top and cool beneath a thin skin of sun-warmed grains. Several football games were being played by the silhouettes of abandoned children where the beach was illuminated. Tristan moved down toward the shadows, where the sea, cresting and collapsing, made lines of foam. The sea's incessant rhythmic noise, its moist breathing while it slept, overlaid the tinier sounds of traffic and music without quite drowning them out. Then, in a place where the lights of the bustling beachfront were especially distant, so that to his expanded pupils the wavering foam had an intimate brilliance of its own, a human shadow was in front of him, and two more were behind. A knife, longer and broader than a finger, reflected starlight on its flat side. "Your watch," a boy's light, panicky voice said, in English. "Don't be a pentelio," Tristan told the sudden presence. "I am one of you." His deep and easy Carioca accent made his assailant falter, but not change attack. "Your watch! Your wallet, credit cards, gold, everything, quickly," he said, adding as if to keep his childish voice from rising out of control, "Filio da puta." "You mean to insult me, but you speak simply the truth," Tristan told him. "Go home to your own whorish mamas, and I will not hurt you." His adult voice trembled as the adrenaline of combat rushed to his chest. He felt the point of a second knife between his shoulder blades, and the hand of a third boy, quick and silent as a lizard on the wall, crept into his coat's breast pocket and lifted out the billfold. This impudent delicacy, as if one of the children he had never had were playing with Papa's clothes, both tickled and enraged Tristan. "You want my watch? Here is my watch." Holding his hands high, Tristan stripped off the flexible band, let them see that it was a Rolex, the heavy wristband alternating gold and platinum, and flipped it into the sea, the firmament of phosphorescence. The knife at Tristan's back had felt dull, like a stick or a knuckle, but it slipped through his coat and skin as easily as a razor, painlessly in the first instant, then with a burning that rapidly swelled into an insult too severe to tolerate. He reached toward his belt for his razor, but there was no razor. Jem had been his friend in another life, and he laughed, wanting to explain this and so much else to the boys, who could have been his sons. Tristan's body fell into a surge of foam, which rapidly receded, tumbling him over once and no more. The boys, frantically thinking to hide his body in the sea, attempted to kick and drag him into the next wave, but, still alive, he grabbed at the ankle of one in a grip as powerful as a torque wrench, and the child, only 12, screamed as if seized by a ghost. He and his friends fled, their bare feet making frantic spurts of sand, and scattered, each melting down a different corridor of darkness across the hustling Avenida Atlantica. Tristan, feeling the warm, pulsing salt water replace his outflowing blood, fainted and died. Isabel, who had sunk rapidly into sleep beneath the weight of the red wine, woke from a dream in which her children, the dead or disappeared 3, mingled with the pampered 3 back in São Paulo in the care of the servants. The unbearable pressure of their demands snapped her body's peace. She awoke, and her growing dread attached to the vacancy beside her in the bed, where Tristan had promised to be, naked. The space, explored first by a tentative, flirtatious foot, and then by a groping, panicked hand, was cool and unwrinkled. She wrapped a long white chenille robe, which had belonged to Aunt Luna and still hung in the closet, around her own nakedness and searched the apartment. She walked to the balcony and pushed open the doors and looked down to see if he was curled on the sofa. The clocks said 5:15. She telephoned the desk downstairs. The sleepy Japanese said the gentleman had gone out a little after midnight, but had not returned. She knocked at her uncle's door. He was impossible to rouse. He took pills and wore earplugs and an eye mask. She went in and reached into his bed's warmth and shook him awake. At first he was disposed to dismiss Tristan's absence as a male peccadillo, but her tears, with an unanswerable force of premonition behind them, led him at last to call the police. The police of Rio are overworked and paid in money whose worth constantly erodes. They are overwhelmed by our propensity for sin and disorder, by the falling away of religious restraints. And yet there was a man on duty who, after a weary time away from the phone, returned to say that no one answering Tristan's description existed on their records of the night. He, too, was inclined to take lightly a case of a wandering husband, but consented, upon being repeatedly reassured of Uncle Donaciano's importance and high connections, to send an officer. Isabel could not wait. Pausing only to put on tan sandals, naked beneath her robe, she strode as if with a sleepwalker's blind determination the transverse blocks to Copacabana, while her uncle, who had thrown on suit trousers and a tieless white shirt, pantingly tried to keep up with her and to talk reason and hope. But there was a screaming hollowness within Isabel that knew how to satisfy itself. She must move forward until this terrible live mortar within found its pestle. The nocturnal scurry of the boites was breaking up. The revelers emerging into the open with their weary slack faces and flimsy spangled costumes and ears ringing with spent ecstasies. A few taxis were moving, their headlights dimming. A few early runners were already out in jogging suits against the morning chill. Night's indistinct clouds, now had clear blue shapes against a sky not yet rose, but a paling brown beyond the humped islands, the sword-sharp horizon. Yes, he would have walked here, this sand where their youthful footprints lay lost among millions of others. He would have walked along the sea's waving skirts like a boy, thinking of himself as he had been, before she had imposed a miracle upon him. From afar she saw, like a speck of roadkill, the dark interruption in the pale highway of sea foam. She did not halt, nor did she run toward the visual anomaly, but took off her sandals and strode in what she imagined as Tristão's deep, spongy steps, though they had been utterly erased. He was face down, the way he slept, his flawless teeth bared in a little frozen snarl. Fidelity, his stiff body said, clinging there to the beach. Uncle Donaciano caught up to her, and a fat young policeman was with him, and a crowd collected in the dawn light of all colors. One black boy, with bug-like eyes, brought Tristão's emptied billfold from where it had been dropped along the curb, and looked to the policeman, and then to Isabel, and lastly to Uncle Donaciano for his reward. Receiving a pastel sheaf of cruzeros, he scampered away, sand flying like wings at his heels. The murderers had superstitiously left in the billfold a photograph of teenaged Isabel and Tristão with their heads together in a booth on Corcovado, and a St. Christopher medal thin as a razor blade. Had she given it to him, back before they had run away? In the air there were questions, expressions of interest and sorrow, and the general expectation focused on Isabel. The crowd waited to hear her wail and keen, giving memorable expression to her grief. Yet the feelings inside her were of a severe formality, like pieces of antique carving, worn and chipped but still testifying to an established symmetry. She remembered a story she had once read, in the early days at the Serra do Barraco, before she became involved with the manicurists and had borne Azor and Cordelia. To fill her lonely days in the miner's shack, she perused the pieces of narrative, crumpled and greasy, in which the tools and supplies came packed to the mountain, mostly concerning the amorous adventures and scandals of the famous. One of them told of a woman, long ago, who, her lover dead, lay down beside him and willed herself to die, and did. She did die. The body of Tristão had been dragged higher on the sand to wait for the ambulance. She lay down beside him and kissed his eyes, his lips. The crowd sensed the grand thing she was attempting and grew reverentially hushed. Only her uncle marred the hush, crying out, "For God's sake, Isabel," in sheer embarrassment at this vulgar display of Brazilian romanticism. She inched her body higher and opened her robe so Tristão's marble face rested against her brown bosom, and curled one arm around him in his dank, drying suit, and asked her heart to stop. She waited to ride her lover's body like that of a dolphin into the submarine realm of death. But the rising sun continued to redden her shut lids, and the chemicals within her continued their intricate exchanges, and the crowd grew bored. There would be no miracle today. Eyes still shut, Isabel could hear people resuming conversations and drifting off. A distant ambulance, like an evil clown with its self-important popping bleat, pierced the hum of humankind to come for Tristão, the piece of litter he had become. The spirit is strong, but blind matter is stronger. Having absorbed this desolating truth, the dark-eyed widow staggered to her feet, tightened her robe about her nakedness, and let her uncle lead her home.